My name is Brian Preston. I'm the chairman of the Young Farmer Committee, and I'm going to be serving as program chair this afternoon. My fellow member of the State Young Farmer Committee, Chris Krazier, will be the moderator of the discussion meet. I'd like to first announce that this year's prizes for the discussion meet winner and thank our sponsors. Today's discussion meet winner will win a trip to the John Deere World Headquarters and a John Deere factory tour in Iowa sponsored by AIS Construction Equipment, or a $500 Cabela's gift card from AIS Construction Equipment, a $500 cash prize from Ford, and an all-expense-paid trip to the American Farm Bureau Federation annual meeting in Nashville, Tennessee to compete in the National Young Farmer and Rancher Discussion Meet. Additionally, all of our 4 finalists will receive a prize package sponsored by Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan and the Michigan Soybean Promotion Committee. Contestants, you may now take your place at the table. For the courtesy of our contestants, I would ask that you would turn off all cell phones at this time. Contestants, this is a discussion, not a debate. Each contestant will give a 30-second opening statement. These statements will be given in random order. The body of the discussion will last 30 minutes for the final round. There will be a 1-minute time period for the contestants to develop a closing statement. 1-minute closing statements will also be given in random order. The timekeeper for today is my fellow State Young Farmer Committee member, Mike DeRuyter, here in the front, from Oceana County. The judges for our discussion meet this afternoon are Al Almy, former director of the Public Policy Division with Michigan Farm Bureau. Thank you. Kim Clark, partner at Varnum Law Firm. Jim Robinson, Executive Vice President of Farm Bureau Insurance. Mike Kovacic, Stakeholder Relations at Michigan State University. Pete Lemmer, General Counsel from Greenstone Farm Credit Services. And Jamie Clover Adams, Director of the Michigan Department of Agriculture and Rural Development. So, at this time, I'd like to turn the program over to our moderator, Chris Krazier.
Thank you, Brian. Our contestants for this afternoon are Jasper Cunningham from Muskegon County, Michael Genovese from Oakland County, Alysa Sanford from Jackson County, and Nathan Prill from Huron County. In my role as moderator, I will not attempt to control or direct this discussion. I will not intervene unless or until disparaging or inappropriate remarks are made. With that in mind, the burden is on the competitors to moderate themselves and conduct themselves in a cooperative and congenial manner. The topic for discussion is, how should Farm Bureau help prepare its members, both young and old, for transferring operations to the next generation of farmers and ranchers? What is Farm Bureau's role in encouraging more transfers? Contestants, you may begin with your opening statements in random order.
As awkward of a conversation this might be to have amongst fellow young farmers and in front of an audience of all generations, it's a very difficult conversation to have at home with family. It's a very important transition that many of us up here will have to go through, and many of the more mature members of the audience most certainly have had to go through. And Farm Bureau definitely plays a role in this transfer. Whether that role is encouraging farmers, I think that's left for some discussion.
In America, we make things and grow things. That's a quote from Senator Debbie Stabenow, chairwoman of the Senate Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry. Making things and growing things is the basis of our family farms, yet that's threatened due to the lack of tools that farmers have during farm succession from one generation to the next. I'm looking forward to discussing how we can bridge this gap with my fellow comrades.
The rural Farm Journal Legacy surveyed a bunch of farmers and found out that 70% of farms will not successfully go to the third generation, and 90% of farms will not successfully make it to the fourth generation. The reason for this is that there are so many complex issues in dealing with farm succession, from tax estate planning to finding roles for each member of the family, dealing with siblings, dealing with divorces. It's very complex, and so I look forward to hearing all of your opinions on how Farm Bureau can provide resources for our members to ease the transition from one generation to the next, and most importantly, for younger generations to carve out their own space within farming operations to increase the viable nature of operations in Michigan.
In just a few short weeks, my youngest brother will be graduating from Michigan State University with a degree in agriculture and heading back home to the family farm. This topic hits very close to home. What will this transition look like? What will happen to those of us that don't live in the area but still want to be involved? This process, thankfully, has been approached early on within my family, starting early and making sure that you follow a plan and that things are clear is hopefully things that we will continue to discuss today to make the transition from one generation to the next as smooth as possible.
Contestants, you may now begin the discussion.
Nathan, I kind of thought it was interesting how you brought up the different roles that individuals play within the family farm and within the transition. Is that something that hits close to home to you? It sounded kind of like it did.
Well, I think it's something we all deal with on our farming operations. You know, I mean, the thing we have to recognize is that the farms that exist now, if they're multi-generational, in order for those farms to be viable and to even exist now, they have suffered through unbelievable periods of turmoil in the agricultural economy in the last 30, 40, 50 years. So the fact that they exist is an amazing reality. So for the people that were so entrepreneurial and so hardworking to make these operations run against all odds, you know, for them to now turn that operation over to somebody else, even though younger people bring new skill sets, a knowledge of technology, access to more information through you know, the use of the internet and computers, you know, it's amazing that even in those instances, because they were such strong leaders and because they were so successful in agriculture, that's what makes it so difficult for the transition to happen.
Yeah, I've heard it said that the first generation builds it, the second generation profits from it, and the third generation ruins it.
And that's so sad that many times that is the case. I've heard horror stories about transitions of farms and children running away with the farm and holding it over parents' heads when they trusted in their children. And it can happen with business partnerships. Anytime things come down to finances, unfortunately, it doesn't matter if you have blood, the same blood running through your veins, it can get ugly. And I think that's why it's really important that Farm Bureau does play a role in this transition. Well, and I'm looking forward to hearing what my fellow members up here, what your ideas are. One thing that I wanted to throw out there is maybe a session at each one of these annual meetings, or maybe even take that a step further and offer some kind of legal counsel that for members, regular members who are interested in the idea of estate planning, which is what we are talking about here.
I agree. It's really important just to start the conversation. And the major issue with starting a conversation is the conversation is premised on the fact that someday someone in that conversation is not going to be there, and the operation does belong to them. And for the older generations, that farm is their retirement. It is their security. And as much as we want to take over the reins, as much as we want to get into the operation and put our own stamp and our own mark on it, we have to be really sensitive to the fact that these operations are the legacy of our ancestors, and if managed correctly, can be managed for the future.
Nathan, I couldn't agree with you more in what you just said, and it's important that when Farm Bureau does play this role, that every party is dealt with the utmost respect. The older generations, blood, sweat, and tears went into these operations, and you have to treat that with respect. If there isn't that a certain level of appreciation, and people won't even want to have this discussion. Jasper, you were...
I think when we start talking about the legacy and the aspects here, first we have to really frame the issue and find out what the problem is. And there are 4 main areas of farm succession, those being financial security, ownership transition, estate planning, and leadership development. And I think from there, once we know exactly what the problem is, that there are multiple and different facets that we have to include to make sure that not just one area of farm succession is successful, to make sure that we're meeting the demands of each generation and to make sure that the bridge is gapped in all areas.
I'd like to bring to point, though, that there might be a 5th area, though, which is the social and emotional aspects. Because we're dealing with families and bonds, there has been many families that have been torn apart because of disagreements in how the farm is transitioned, or once it has been transferred to the younger generation, how it is managed. I mean, that's a really, and what you said, Nathan, is, I mean, you're talking about a transition where eventually one person will no longer be there. I talked to a gentleman not too long ago who said, hey, if I would have known my parents didn't have life insurance, we might still be farming now, because there wasn't that communication, there wasn't that conversation that takes place between 2 individuals that have that bond. I mean, things could look very, very different.
Alysa, you bring up a great point of that this is not only a business dynamic, it's a family dynamic. And that's something that when you look at it, estate planning is something very different than a family dynamic. And I think one of the greatest programs that Farm Bureau currently offers is, you know, the Partners in Agricultural Leaders. And I think that's something, whether or not we include a new branch on that, or we create a new Farm Bureau program where they can sit down and they can teach them the negotiation, the communication skills, and the leadership skills, and also the family dynamic, because that's something we're lacking in. It's truly how to not only start those conversations, but continue through them to make sure that after the transition has happened, that things are still successful.
Right,
I think it's
continuing that process and kind of creating that checklist of, okay, here's how you begin the conversation, and here's where it goes from there. Because like you said, it doesn't just end once the transition has happened. It continues on over a period of time. I'm sorry, Nathan, go ahead.
Quite all right. I'll tell you, though, one thing that really has me thinking here, though, is that, you know, Farm Bureau has a lot of resources. But I think something we shouldn't forget is about linking to the private sector, because, you know, in some cases, Farm Bureau is a family organization, and it's not neutral territory. And when you do farm succession, one of the major things that you'll learn is that, you know, it's important to have neutral territory where emotions aren't involved, where maybe siblings or spouses that aren't directly involved in the farming operation have a different role in that conversation. And so I think it's important that we also link to the resources in the private sector. The legal, financial services, accounting, they've gotten a lot more resources because there are hundreds of billions of dollars of farm assets that are going to transition within the next few years.
Particularly in the land options. Yeah. I mean, anybody can go out and buy a tractor. You don't necessarily have to own land to buy a tractor, but in order to, I mean, you need to have that land in order to farm, whether it be crops or animals, livestock. But you talk about the private sector too, accounting, lawyers, but we also have to consider counselors, just moderators for having those family discussions. And whether or not Farm Bureau is the one to provide those, but making those lists of resources available. But Farm Bureau also, I think, plays an integral role in the lobbying aspect of what this organization does. With looking at the taxes, I mean, when we're passing a farm down from one generation to the next, I mean, there can be a cost to that, to both.
Alysa, at the end of the year, the estate tax is going to go down to $1 million. I mean, it's unthinkable that legislation could change that could so drastically, you know, affect our rural communities. And it's really quite terrifying. And as you say, rightfully, it's a policy issue.
Nathan, to add to what you're saying, at the end of the year, not only does it go down to $1 million, but the taxation also increases to 55%. That means 55% of all liquid assets after the passing of a family can be taken and seized due to a tax. And that's something that, you know, when land prices from 2011 to 2012 increased by 15%, and the government considers land to be a liquid asset, when it cannot be easily sold off, or why should it be sold off to pay for it? I think that's something where we see Farm Bureau coming into play, especially with the lobbying aspect,
and
as Alysa
Jasper,
said.
that's been a very important issue that Farm Bureau has brought to the forefront for many years down in Washington at the Washington legislative seminars that it puts on. And still, Congress unfortunately hasn't made any significant progress on this. But Nathan, I wanted to touch on something that you said a moment ago in terms of providing, and you too, Alysa, with providing counsel, whether it be counselors or legislative counsel, or legal counsel rather. Farm Bureau can play this role, and it can. I believe that they can provide a nonpartisan player in this discussion, as well as provide resources. I know currently in our policy book, which governs our organization, we don't have any policy that specifically addresses providing these services to its regular members. In the past, we did have this policy, but unfortunately, not very many people took advantage of it. The older generations weren't as interested as the younger generations to become involved.
Michael, you bring up a great point, and I think what we're deeming it is, and I can personally say, if you're saying we need to go to family counseling to turn this, that's going to have a negative connotation. We need to look at the aspect of one of the greatest new things for young farmers on this side is that partners in agricultural leadership. And so whether or not we can continue to determine a new program or add aspects that can include that. Currently, that program only allows for a narrow range of individuals who meet certain specifications. And that's one of the things, is that this succession is going to happen to every farm at some point. Well, and whether or not we can equip them with the skills is the biggest thing we need to take into consideration.
I think something we need to keep in mind, though, is that if we are too specific about what we're trying to do to help these transitions, we're going to lose people, because as each individual is different, right, each farm is very unique in what they produce, how many years they've been doing it, their assets, and those individuals within their family that are looking to take it over, whether it be a daughter and a son-in-law, or two sons, or even just a nephew or a niece. I mean, these are all very unique, specific portions of this big problem that we have.
I like that.
I caution to say problem, because it's not a problem. It's a good thing. That's what so many older generations wanted to do. They wanted to create a farm that they could pass on to their children and grandchildren. That was what they put their blood, sweat, and tears into. And to see it actually do that, I mean, you're reaching that goal that you did that for.
Well, one of the things that I found is, especially when it comes to succession, is that if you adopt the family business as is, not even taking into account the fact that that business model may not be viable in 40 years, it's that the most important thing that we can encourage and that we can do ourselves in our own farming operations is to carve out our own space, carve out our own niche, so that we can prove our leadership skills, we can prove our knowledge, we can add to the business in a way that isn't us necessarily acting as a hired woman or as a hired man. By carving out our own space and by giving resources within Farm Bureau, not just to, this is what happens when someone dies, this is what happens when someone gets a divorce, this is what happens when you adopt a child, saying, what can you do, what can you bring to the business, what do you separately bring distinct and individually that will add to that farming operation and make it viable into the future. Because I'll tell you, I know a lot of people who've inherited 1,000 acres of land and lost every square inch of it, because it's not just about having a good succession plan, it's about being a good business person and having good knowledge.
Nathan, you bring up a great point there. I can proudly say that I'm a first-generation agriculturalist. I did not grow up with an agriculture background, but when I got started in high school, I started a seed business, and that led to the implementation of growing specialty crops and seed and plants for seeds. And I can tell you that planning is one of the most important things you can do. Because currently, I'm 20-year-old. I don't have a next generation to pass it down to, so I need to make sure that the skills and opportunities that I have, and that's why I have such a vested interest in this, is this something near and dear to my heart, being a startup. And when you pass those roadblocks, you need to make sure that you have those skills and those talents to continue on. And that's why I'm really glad you brought up the niche aspect of it.
And also to build on what you were saying, Nathan, is I know a lot of farms, at least in Oakland County, in my area, that the children are part of a co-op with their parents. So each has their own role on the farm. They're sometimes allowed a budget for different improvements or different things that they want to change to the farm. And each family is obviously different and with their dynamic and what is considered acceptable and not. But I think it's important that Farm Bureau specifically in their role that with this transfer could produce some generally accepted practices. Let's use a common term that we all understand here and can relate to. A checklist for different things that you want to look into and you want to prepare for a farm transfer.
Some of those things, I think, Michael, and generally accepted practice is very nice. Good one on that. I mean, making sure that we have things in writing. How many times is there discussions on the farm? Oh, yeah, we're going to do this. We're going to do that. But until we have things in writing that makes it very clear to all the parties involved that this is going to be the role that each individual is going to take. This is how you're going to be compensated, whether it is a percentage, a salary, an hourly wage, an agreement to purchase after X number of years. I mean, all of those are really great questions. I mean, I talked about my brother going back to the farm. I asked my dad just last night, so is he getting a percentage? Is he working hourly? What is he doing? And the question was kind of, well, and it kind of stopped there, unfortunately. And as someone who would love to play a part in that farm, it kind of worried me that they hadn't quite had that conversation yet.
Michael?
And Alyssa, it's so important, and even beyond that, heaven forbid there's a tragedy, and this discussion hasn't even occurred to anyone yet, and a parent or a family member who does control the farm is no longer able to operate or run the farm. What happens with the farm? Where do the assets of the farm go? Where does it lie? Somebody may have been under the assumption that they would be taking care of the farm, but if there's no will, if there's no basic structure or document discussed long before anyone's planning on their own end, it's an important topic that needs to be addressed. And Jasper, it sounded like you had a point.
Michael and Alyssa, you brought up great points. I really enjoy the generally accepted practices. And I think one of the most important is the one we're doing here is we're getting the topic on the table. How many times does this actually come up? How many times do we actually discuss it and hold a proactive conversation that we can use? And I think that's one of the most important ways that Farm Bureau can come in, is to hold that conversation, whether it's a workshop. And we talked about, earlier we were talking about, well, it can't be narrow. Well, no, we need to make sure it's broad, and the way we do that is by opening up this conversation, and that's one of the most important things that we can do.
Really, once that conversation begins, I mean, if Farm Bureau was able to provide a checklist or a tool that said, okay, you've started the conversation, that's great. Now, where do you go from there? Then you make sure that you have life insurance, you've got a will, you've got a plan for how that property, equipment, facilities, et cetera, is going to be divided and transitioned over time, and you have a written agreement. Then I think it's also important that you start looking at it as a business. Okay, we're going to have monthly or quarterly meetings. We're all going to sit down. We're going to discuss this with a moderator or outside individual to make sure that it's fair, not being, and doesn't get too cutthroat, because you can still have a business and you can have a family and create that family business that is going to be an asset to everyone, and at the same time honoring and respecting those next generations. Because yes, there is a transition period, but there's also that period beyond the transition where we want to make sure that we're being respectful as well.
I think it's very fortunate that, you know, the one thing that I will say is my sense is that these issues are always on the table. It sounds like, you know, you're in the early stages of maybe a family transition, maybe something that won't happen for another 20 or 30 years, and it's already there. See, the interesting thing that happens in the ag economy is that when it's going really well and when it's very profitable, as it has been, and when land and acres in Michigan that were purchased for $800 an acre are now worth $10,000 an acre, my sense is that the issue is on the table. So fortunately, I think Farm Bureau then can play a role in saying, listen, these are estate planners, these are your local lawyers who specialize in estate law. This is what we're doing legislatively to ensure that you're not going to get hit by an estate tax or by any, onerous legislation that will harm your farming operation for the future. And just encouraging young people to get involved, to network, to learn more about technology, to develop leadership skills, because any plan that you have is going to come to nothing if the person who's inheriting is not prepared to deal with siblings, deal with spouses, deal with leadership issues and making decisions.
Nathan?
It's kind of one of those situations where you kind of have to have the shovel before you get the checkbook.
Right.
That's how farm succession is.
I think one thing that might be beneficial that we haven't touched on yet is the experiences, and actually, Jasper, you talked a little bit about starting your own seed business. Having experience outside of the family farm with someone else as your boss besides your parent, I think is a very beneficial opportunity for anyone looking to take over a family farm.
Because if you're talking about a multi-million-dollar business, if your parent sees you as the hired help, they're in no way, it's going to be
turn over the keys
exactly,
to the tractor.
It's such a mental leap to go from, this is a child who maybe works hard, but,
still a child,
smashed the tractor into the silo when he was 14 years old, or when she was 14 years old. That stays with you. And so it's important that young people have spaces to prove their leadership skills, and so that they are genuinely ready to take over these farming
I think there's
Right.
a lot of parents who, it's one reason why they'll send their kids to school and want to make sure that they do get a college or a university education before they come back to the farm, give them an opportunity to branch out, have other experiences, to make sure their heart really is in that place, and they gain a new set of experiences that they can bring back to the farm. Before too much more time goes by, Nathan, you touched on it just briefly a moment ago, but Farm Bureau's role in encouraging more transfers. Personally, I don't think it's Farm Bureau's role to encourage family members and people to transfer their farm to someone else. I don't think this is a spot where Farm Bureau should be. Providing guidance, absolutely, and it sounds like we're all in agreement up here that it's important for Farm Bureau to provide a level of guidance or a checklist. What are your all's positions?
I think the biggest thing when we talk about encouraging, and we've hit on it, is forming the relationships. Nathan was talking about a little bit earlier when you were talking about getting into the private sector and the estate planning and the legality aspect. But we need to make sure that they're equipped with the ability to hold a conversation like a farmer would with their seed salesman. They want to be comfortable and they want to know that. And I think encouraging that is something, that we can base it off, is forming those relationships to make sure that, at this stage of infancy, whenever it happens, that it will be successful. It's never too early to start planning, and I think that's what the encouraging aspect comes down to, is prepping, whether or not, generations down the road, it's set up to make sure that smooth transitions can take place.
I guess I interpreted a little bit differently. I mean, I might be wrong compared to you guys, but really I took it as an individual that, an older generation that has no heirs that they are able to pass the farm on to or don't want to take over the farm. I guess I looked at it more as Farm Bureau's role in connecting and encouraging those older and those younger generations to connect and to really create that transition, maybe not to a child, but to another individual that wants to take on that farm and wants to respect that land or those animals. That was the way I interpreted it, and I really think that Farm Bureau can play a role in encouraging those kind of transitions as far as making those connections, providing the resources to help them really decide whether or not that is a connection they want to make with an individual. But I guess that Farm Bureau should feel that it's important to maintain family farms and to maintain land in agricultural production as generations continue, because if those older generations can't find someone to pass their farm on to, I mean, we're looking at more land being developed or purchased by really, really large farms, and we're losing a greater number of family farms. That was my interpretation.
And I'll tell you, it's difficult, though, because the definition of the family farm is changing. And you see all the time corporations made up of 3 LLCs, made up of individual trusts, and it's a family farm. And so farm succession has become illegal,
process.
You know,
Absolutely.
Well, I think when Alyssa, you brought it up, is interpretations. I don't think we should limit to one interpretation. I think this is something that in any way, whether 98% of all farms are considered to be a family-owned farm. So, you know, whether or not it's a corporation or a family farm, specifically a family farm, we need to make sure that those transitions can take place effectively in any interpretation, because again, like we said earlier, each farm and each family is different and unique. So we need to make sure that we have those opportunities to be unique, to match theirs.
and worse, I mean, farming is a small business, and a lot of small businesses fail, frankly. They fail sometimes not by any fault of the person who's running the business, but it is a inherently risky thing. So when we talk about farm succession, I think maybe we also have to have some honesty that in some cases farm succession is not going to be viable if the child or if the heir or if the person that you come in contact with simply isn't capable of running a modern business with everything that that entails.
Yeah, with looking at small businesses outside of agriculture, really 25% of small businesses, only 25% succeed in that second generation. So, I mean, there is a lot of struggles in looking at agriculture and the family farm as a business. I mean, that's an important conversation that you need to have. Is this heir that you're passing your farm onto, are they ready to step up and be CEO and CFO, and I mean all of those different titles that go along with it, as well as the maintenance help that gets called at 2 a.m. in the morning?
Absolutely. There's a lot of different aspects to look at when going into this issue. And when you look at Farm Bureau as an organization and its role in this, I think it's important we're a grassroots organization. I think it's important that the members start talking about this, and I hope this discussion spurs some interest in the crowd and maybe some members of the policy development committees of each county to maybe create some policy to insert policy into our policy book for the future to establish some of these guidelines, or maybe create the foundation for the future so Farm Bureau can grow this, because absolutely it's very important. It's a personal issue for me. I could possibly be going through this in the next years, and if I had a guide from Farm Bureau, a respectable organization, and even some legal guidance, which I know has been floated around with at the executive level, providing legal counsel to some of their members. I think it'd be a great start.
Michael, you brought up a great point of the policy aspect, but with that, policy is often standardized. And I think with that, you know, the programs and the tools that Farm Bureau can offer before a policy is implemented can also be more beneficial, because that's going to provide opportunities for each farm to get a taste of it and to decide, you know, which aspect or where they need to work on to ensure that their transition is successful.
During this transition, one thing that I'd kind of like to bring up is really for the younger generation, being able to accept that they are not necessarily going to be able to keep the same standard of living that their parents, the older generation, is living at that time. I mean, the parents, the older generation, had to work very hard to get where they're at, and for the younger generation to just assume that they're going to start out at that same standard of living with the nice house and the multiple vehicles isn't necessarily fair. And I think that could create some animosity, some hard feelings, some arguments between the two generations without that understanding of, I mean, you kind of have to work our way up within no matter what industry that we're in.
Do you think that's navigable? Because, I mean, there are some issues that will break a small farm. Mm-hmm. You know, when we're talking about divorces, we're talking about sibling rivalry, we're talking about maybe a generation that's not prepared with the leadership skills necessary to run the business, and then other generations seeing that. You know, this is a very contentious issue that, you know, I mean, I'd be interested to hear what you think Farm Bureau could do in these situations. It seems quite a challenging, you know, hill to climb.
As we had touched on earlier, I mean, providing a neutral party to discuss these issues and to look at it from an outside perspective, and determine whose argument may be more valid than another's, to put it politely. But I think Farm Bureau definitely could play a huge role or provide a huge service to its members by having having this program.
I think that's part of where the written agreement comes in, and really bringing in possibly legal counsel when you're doing up that agreement kind of keeps it really clear. You develop the agreement at a time when the divorce hasn't happened, when the siblings are still getting along, that says, okay, this is how we're going to handle these situations. And yes, when it comes down to that time, it may be, there may be questions, but if you start out with a written plan that everyone's aware of, that everyone that's involved has a hand in, that's going to be important. And that's where I think, like you said, Farm Bureau can really step in and say, okay, in your written plan, you should talk about X, Y, and Z, because yeah, my written plan might say so-and-so Johnny gets the tractor, Billy gets the combine, and so-and-so gets 200 head of cattle. That could be our simple agreement where it really needs to elaborate on, in the case of a divorce, this is what happens.
Alyssa, you brought up a great point of making sure that that plan isn't in place. And with that, I also think an important part to include is a business plan, specifically because a lot of time farms are run as a small business, and to make sure that planning in the continuation once the transition has taken place is brought on both sides, both generations, to make sure that it's a smooth transition, to make sure that not only both sides of the to make sure that both sides of the plan go effectively.
That business plan is also a great way to kind of start to move past the we've always done it this way mentality. That business plan can be an area where all the parties involved can say, hey, this is something I'd really like to try. This is my plan for implementing it. That might be an opportunity to really kind of bridge the future.
Is that with farm succession, with the way that things are going with health insurance, with the uncertainty of Social Security, we don't know where these farm assets will ultimately end up. And that is the thing that puts a big question mark on everything that we've been talking about, because we can't predict the future. But if you have those conversations, it seems like that's the way. And by Farm Bureau facilitating those conversations, we can build, more options for people who are going through this difficult process.
Plan for the worst and hope for the best.
That's right.
Good advice.
Yeah.
Thank you, contestants. You now have 1 minute to prepare your closing statement. Audience, please remain silent while the contestants prepare their statements. Time. Please put your pens down. You may now begin with your closing statements in random order.
I'd like to thank my fellow contestants up here for a truly great discussion. This is a very difficult issue, possibly the most difficult that we had to speak on all day, because it all hits us so personally on all of our operations and all of our experience. I think it's very important that Farm Bureau first creates policy, since currently we do not have any policy regarding this issue. From there, depending on how the policy reads, provide some guidance to its members or some legal counsel to help be an arbiter of the transition of farms. But I do not believe it should go encouraging its members to partake in this form of estate planning. And that's really a personal issue that should be left up to the farms. Once again, thank you for this great discussion.
Uncertainty is a fact of farm life, but it doesn't have to be when it comes to farm succession. We've had a wonderful discussion talking about some of the tools and tactics we can use, whether that be implementing financial security programs, business planning, and farm transition activities. I would love nothing more than 50 years from today to be able to pass down my operation to the next generation. Sure, it's small, but there would be nothing more satisfying. And to make sure that can happen, it's time to implement the strategies we've talked about and make sure that the conversation is open, taking into consideration family dynamics. Thank you.
Given the uncertainties of farm succession, I think one of the most important things we spoke about today, and I appreciated hearing not only your own opinions, but your own life experiences as we deal with this issue as young farmers, is that, to me, in my mind, the most important thing we can do is develop our leadership skills, utilize the resources that Farm Bureau provides for us to develop our own knowledge, our own networks, our own skills, so that we can prove our leadership and our viability as future, farmers, and build those relationships. Because when we carve out our own space on our farming operation, we're not relying on parents or grandparents for our future. We're proving our worth. We're proving our worth to ourselves, and we're proving our worth to the other generations that we are able and responsible to take over the challenge that's going to come from managing large operations. That to me seems like the best area that Farm Bureau can pursue to ensure good farm succession. And I appreciate hearing all of your stories and your opinions.
Years of hard work and sacrifice have created the American dream of the family farm. It is not without regret that we see the older generations pass, but with excitement that we see the newer generations take over the family farm. But in order to make this a smooth transition, we've talked today about essentially starting early, planning ahead, making sure that we have these conversations with both generations and all of those involved, creating a written agreement so that it's clear on what we expect and how we are going to handle different situations, seeking outside advice and support, also making sure that we're maintaining that relationship throughout the whole process of the transition from beginning and beyond. I think it's important that we also remember that this isn't a sad time, that this is an exciting time, that we can take over what was that American dream and really see it move on to the next generation.
Thank you. I will now turn the meeting back over to the program chairman, Brian.
Thank you, contestants, for that excellent discussion. Let's give them all a round of applause. I would ask that the judges complete their score sheets in the diamond room, which is right out these doors. So the judges would be dismissed right now. They'll go with Jason Jekyll. He'll meet you in that room, and he will pick up your score sheets. I'd like to thank all of our participants, judges, sponsors, and spectators for joining us today for our Young Farmer events. The scores will be tabulated and the winner of the discussion meet announced tonight at the Young Farmer Awards Banquet.